Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're located. And thank you, Kelly. I'm a retired veterinary pathologist, but my real passion are the nut trees. And today we're going to be talking about pecans and hickories suitable for use in Kentucky landscapes or as alternative agricultural crops here in Kentucky. If you're located elsewhere, this may or may not be exactly pertinent, but some of it probably is applicable. Pecans and hickories make a very nice landscape tree in addition to, the benefits that we're all aware of in the form of the nuts. And this is a nice hickory tree that's actually growing in Portland, Oregon, but it shows the nice fall color, and I decided to put that in there. Pecans and hickories are species of trees that are native to Kentucky, and they've historically been looked at primarily as an agricultural crop and have really been underutilized in landscape plantings because they are a strongly taprooted species, and there have been some issues in the past with propagation of these and getting them into a form that homeowners can plant and successfully grow, in suburban and urban and even rural landscape settings. They are members of the genus Carya. They're very long-lived trees. They may live 200 years or more. There's one shellbark hickory that we'll be talking about later in the presentation that has been aged at over 600 years here in Kentucky, and it's still growing and producing nuts on a regular basis. They make very nice yard trees. They're a great shade tree. And in addition to the shade and their beauty from an aesthetic standpoint, they provide very tasty, nutritious nuts. In particular, they have a high oil content. They have a high zinc and selenium level, which is important for as cofactors for a lot of enzymes in our bodily functions. And they also serve as a host for a number of different wildlife species. This is a pecan growing in someone's yard. I'm going to guess that this tree is probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 years old. You can see that it's a nice spreading tree, casting a lot of shade. So you could sit there in the evening shelling peas or butter beans, snapping beans in the shade of that pecan tree. So the native range, this is the native range map from the U.S. Forest Service of pecan, and you can see that it largely follows the river systems here in the central part of the United States, and it goes all the way up into northern Illinois, pretty well up to northern Iowa even. So the native range of these pecans is very, very extensive. There's a wide range in different types of pecans over this area and size and nutritional makeup of the nuts from those trees. But it is a widely distributed tree in nature, and certainly humans have spread it around even more. In Kentucky, if you look at the map of Kentucky or the map of Kentucky there in this range map, you can see that pecan is native to the far western portions of the state, primarily along the Ohio and Green Rivers. So it is native to Kentucky. When I first moved here 30 years ago, my wife wanted to plant some pecan trees, and I said, well, they won't grow here, but I was wrong. They are native here, and actually some of the best pecans for this part of the world, the northern and midwestern pecan belt, originated here in Kentucky. The best pecan varieties for growth here in Kentucky are primarily the types that we consider to be a northern or midwestern pecan. The nuts on these trees are smaller than the large southern varieties that we're accustomed to finding in the grocery stores, but they are adapted to grow in a shorter growing season than you would experience in Texas, Louisiana, and other Gulf Coast states. And these northern Midwestern pecans also tend to have a higher oil content and a better flavor than many of those big southern pecan varieties. Some of the major preeminent northern pecan cultivars originated here in Kentucky. Major and Green River are two names that pop up frequently when we look at the literature. Those originated in a 400-acre block of native pecan forest in the Green River Delta near Owensboro. Pecans do not come true from seed, so if you plant a pecan seed nut, it will grow into a pecan and it may be a very nice yard tree, but the chances of that tree producing high quality nuts is going to be pretty iffy. It may take anywhere from 15 to 25 years for that seedling to come into production, and you may have the best nut ever, or it may be a really small or an ugly nut. So most of the commercial pecans that are planted are grafted. They're essentially a clone of a tree that's been selected for, high nut quality, large nuts, good disease resistance, and then grafted onto a seedling rootstock. So we've cloned this tree. We know what the nut size and kernel quality are going to be. We're going to know what the disease and pest resistance of that uh, original tree is like, and we'll be able to tailor our maintenance program to suit what that tree is going to require. And additionally, since we've grafted this tree with wood from a mature tree that's been through its juvenile period, this tree growing from this graft will produce nuts in half the time or less that a seedling tree would require to grow to its mature fruit bearing age. Pecans are monoecious, means they have both male and female flowers present on the same tree, but they express dichogamy, meaning that the male and female flowers are not present or active at the same time. So they're mostly non-self-fertile. They may have pollen catkins out and producing pollen early on, and then later on the female flowers, the nutlet flowers, emerge. So for most pecans, they are not reliably self-fertile. There may be enough overlap that if you had a single pecan tree, you might get some nuts, but most of them are not going to feel very well. And certainly if you were looking at that as a source of seedlings, those seedlings are going to have decreased vigor. So ideally, we want at least one each of what we call a type 1 and a type 2. The pollination is by air or wind. We don't have bees or other pollinators carrying the pollen is just blowing in the wind. So the type 1s are the ones that we call, protandrous. They produce their pollen catkins, the staminate catkins first, and then later on they have their female flowers. The type 2s or protogynous types have the female flowers first, and then they put out their pollen catkins. So we need both a type 1 and type 2 in order to get really, really good pollination and ensure good crops of nuts. So here are a couple of flowers. On the left, you see the staminate catkins. Those are the flowers, if you will, that produce pollen. And over on the right side are the female nutlet flowers that are present out on the ends of new emerging shoots. These both come out in the springtime. My pecans at the house have finished blooming, and those catkins have all dropped off, and they're all over the porch and the front steps. So the two types of pecans, we can differentiate them by looking at the catkins when they emerge. And here I have twigs from two different trees. The one on the bottom, if you'll notice, has kind of short, fat, thick little catkins. That is a type 1. Those are the ones that are going to have their catkins emerging first, and then the nutlet flowers. The one on top has longer, more slender catkins, and this is a type 2 or protogynous pecan, and it will have its nutlet flowers receptive first, and then it puts out its catkins, pollen catkins. So we can look at that catkin production and determine whether we have a type 1 or a type 2 tree. All right, pests and diseases. There's one fungal disease that is of utmost importance from an economic standpoint, if this were a commercial venture or even for home growers. And that's pecan scab. It is a fungus that affects leaves, twigs, and nuts. And it is the most economically significant disease of pecans around the world. Heavy infections will often destroy the nut crops. You may have a beautiful tree that sets a huge crop of nuts, but if it's susceptible to pecan scab and you are unable to spray adequately to control that fungus, you're not going to get any edible nuts from it. Commercial pecan orchards often are growing varieties that are known to be susceptible to scab, but they produce large pecans that the public wants, and they have to carry out an extensive program of spraying. And they may be spraying a minimum of 3 times per year, but oftentimes every 2 weeks or so. And they're going to require some pretty sophisticated air blast sprayers in order to get good coverage in these trees that may be 60 to 40 to 60 to 80 feet tall. It's just something that a home and low input grower cannot accomplish. So when we're looking at growing pecans in a home setting or a low input farm setting, we want to choose varieties that are known to have good resistance to pecan scab. The major pecan, that's the name of a variety which was selected back around 1910 from that block of native pecans up in the Green River Delta at Owensboro, Kentucky, has been used extensively by the USDA and Kansas State and other private individuals in breeding programs for pecans because it passes on excellent resistance to pecan scab to its offspring. In addition to a few other really important features, it produces its offspring tend to have really, really good kernel quality and have the ability to downsize their nuts in drought years so that rather than having a big nut with a shriveled kernel, you get a smaller nut with a nice well-filled kernel. But its major use has been because of its exceptional resistance to pecan scab. So here I've got 2 pictures of pecan nuts that are affected with pecan scab fungus. You can see these black spots, and the pecans on the left screen are really severely affected. These nuts oftentimes will not fill, and they will become what we call stick tights. That husk will not separate from those pecans. Oftentimes they're stuck up in the tree, or they may drop with that husk material attached and you can't remove it. So those pecans are literally worthless from an edibility standpoint. So what we want is to select varieties that are resistant to the scab infection. I've mentioned Major. This photograph has pictures of nuts from Major and 3 of her daughters, Kansas, Lakota, and Hart. And you can see that those nut husks are all very nice, clean, green, very little in the way of black spots, as opposed to these here in this picture. So Major and many of its offspring have assumed a really, really prominent role in pecan production in the northern and midwestern pecan belt. Kansas and Lakota are both getting a lot of use in the southern pecan belt as well, because Kansas is a very early pecan nut down there. Lakota is a very high quality pecan, and it's a large nut, so it's seeing some use in the south as well. Pecan weevils and stink bugs are probably the 2 major insect pests that we're going to see in pecans here in Kentucky. The photograph on the left here shows a number of pecans that are infected with the pecan weevil. And when you find pecans with that little hole in them, that's where the weevil has exited after eating the pecan kernel inside that nut. And there may be anywhere from 1 to 2 to 5 or 6 of these weevil larvae growing inside any individual pecan. So the weevils lay their eggs in those pecans early in the development, and by the time they're ready to drop out to the ground, the weevils will have consumed much of the nut meats. They exit through that hole, pupate in the ground, and the next generation starts the next spring. On the right, we have some pecans that have been fed upon by stink bugs or leaf-footed bugs. And as they pierce the shell, feeding on that developing nut, they damage it, and we see these black spots. And the one on the bottom was damaged early in development, and the kernel just did not develop. But those black spotted pecan nut meats will have a rancid flavor from the very time they drop from the tree. They are not tasty and not something that you want to eat. So pecan scab, pecan weevil, and stink bug are the biggest problems that we encounter with pecans here in Kentucky. There are some other problems that we do encounter, but they're of a much lesser importance than the big three we've already talked about. Twig girdlers are beetles that actually girdle the twig, and they lay their eggs in the portion beyond where they girdle. They drop off onto the ground, and then the eggs hatch, and those larvae emerge from that dead twig and pupate in the ground. Black and yellow aphids can be a problem, and with some of these scab-resistant varieties, we're starting to see more issues with insect pests like the aphids than we typically encountered when we were dealing with scab-susceptible ones. Fall webworm, very common problem. We see them frequently, and a lot of people will call them bagworms. They're not bagworms, they're fall webworms, and they can be unsightly, but rarely do they cause a significant decrease in crop load. Powdery mildew can be a problem on some specific varieties of pecans. So for the most part, these are lesser pests. And in some cases they may build up to levels where they're a problem, but most of the time they're just a nuisance. Photo here on the left, that's fall webworm in a pecan, and you'll see these uh, nests of these caterpillars that are eating the leaves. You can spray with insecticides, but generally I just pull the ones that I can reach and don't worry about the rest of them. On the right is a twig girdler, and you can see that that insect has girdled that twig. They tend to they really like pecans and hickories and persimmons. They hit other species, but those are the big three for the twig girdlers, are the ones that cause us the most consternation when you go out into your orchard and you're finding these twigs that have been cut off by the twig girdlers, especially if they have a nice big cluster of developing nuts out there on the end of that twig. All right, pecan cultivars that are good for Kentucky. Again, those northern Midwestern types are best. There are some new selections that have been developed, particularly by USDA, by crossing these northern Midwestern types with some of the larger southern pecans. And some of the southern pecan varieties will actually work in warmer areas. We're quite a bit warmer over here in Western Kentucky than perhaps over in Eastern Kentucky. And some of those older southern varieties or larger southern varieties may actually work here. But in general, we try to stick with those northern Midwestern types. Of the type ones, the ones that do really well here in Kentucky are Major, Park, which is a major seedling, and Warren 346. Dr. Bill Reed at Kansas State University has been breeding pecans for about 30 years, and he has some new releases within the last 5 years. Of the type ones, Liberty, Caney, Thayer, and St. Paul all look very promising. They are all crosses of Major or Green River with Pawnee, which is a large, high quality pecan that has awful scab susceptibility. But these all appear to be scab resistant, and they have really, really good kernel quality. Of the type twos, Kanza and Lakota are both major offspring, and they are very good, high quality pecans with good scab resistance. Posey is an older variety from southern Indiana. It's one of the larger of the northern pecans. Green River, another Kentucky origin uh, pecan. Oswego, which is a seedling of Green River that was selected at the Kansas State breeding program. Labette, Earlton, and Pleasanton are some newer varieties released from the Kansas State program. They're still on trial, but they look very promising. And again, they are crosses of Green River or Major with Pawnee. There are other local selections. There are a lot of pecans that people have selected around the state and around the country that are kind of like regional favorites, if you will. They may not have gained widespread acceptance, but they may be the growers in Indiana really like this one, or the growers in Missouri really like this one. There are some of the southern varieties or offspring of southern varieties that will grow here, but you have to use fungicidal sprays, and that's not going to work for most home growers. In general, we recommend people avoid southern varieties like Stewart, Mahan is desirable. Those are all well-known varieties, and a lot of times they show up at the big box stores or Tractor Supply or Rural King, and people take them home and plant them, and the trees will live, but they may not ever get a decent nut from those. So stay away from those southern varieties if you're growing in Kentucky. So I've got some photos here. This is Major. It's a small nut. It runs about 78 nuts per pound, but it has a really, really high quality kernel. And again, it has great resistance to pecan scab, high quality kernel. It has the ability to downsize its nuts if it gets into a drought situation, and it almost always produces on an annual basis and produces high quality kernels. This is Posey. It's that southern Indiana nut. It's one of the larger, thinner shelled nuts of the northern varieties. It has an excellent buttery flavor. Its only knock is that, well, it has a couple of knocks. It's not a heavy producer, but as a result, it pretty much bears every year. It doesn't drop into an annual bearing habit like many of the pecans do, and its kernels tend to darken quickly. It still tastes good, but they look like an old pecan if you don't crack them out and get them in the freezer pretty soon after they drop. This is Lakota. It's a cross of Major with Mahan, the big, huge paper shell nut from down south. It has excellent scab resistance and excellent kernel quality, and it's really making some inroads even in the southern pecan commercial production arena. And here's a nice little bowl of Major nuts that have been cracked out. They've not been picked out, but you can see that a large percentage of those come out as intact halves just on first crack. It's a really, really nicely flavored nut with a high oil content. All right, productive pecan trees and productive nut trees, really of any species, are heavy nitrogen feeders. And if we want maximum production or optimal production on these trees, we need to do multiple split fertilizer applications, oftentimes 2 to 3 applications in the spring and then one in the fall. Zinc deficiency is a problem in some parts of the country, but it's typically not a problem in Kentucky. It's mainly an issue where you have um, high pH soils, high limestone soils. So neutral to acidic soils, zinc is usually not a problem. Most pecans don't require much in the way of pruning. Some early training pruning cuts to make sure that branch placement is good. You don't have narrow branch angles with included bark. But, after that, really not a lot to do to them. Deer love pecans. They will browse the leaves off and the bucks will rub them vigorously. So if you're planting pecans anywhere that there's significant deer pressure, you need to protect them either with grow tubes or with a cage or high fence to exclude deer. So any pecans that I have growing out in the pastures or in plantings out in the open anymore. I have to tube them and or cage them to keep the deer from destroying them. Ideal spacing for mature trees, we're talking about 60 feet apart because these are huge trees. I'm old enough now in my late 60s that I'm planting them on 30-foot spacings because I'm not going to live long enough to see them get too big. So, you know, if you're on a small suburban lot, one tree may be all you have room for. So you need to talk your neighbors into planting some. All right, resources. We have a Kentucky Nut Growers Association, and as Kelly mentioned, I'm the treasurer for that, and I'm the one who takes your dues and your membership application. It's really inexpensive to join, $5 per year. We have 2 meetings per year, usually we have a central Kentucky location for the spring meeting, and then we'll alternate between an eastern and a western location for the fall meeting. Occasionally, we'll have a summer grafting demonstration. We had one of those again this year, and a semi-annual newsletter. The Northern Nut Growers, which incorporated in 1910, so it's been around for nearly 120 years. $40 a year. Lots and lots of information available from the Northern Nut Growers Association. They publish a quarterly online newsletter. They print a yearly proceedings from articles that are submitted for presentation at their yearly annual meeting. And they have all of the the last 115 years of proceedings and newsletters digitally recorded on a flash drive that you can get for about $100, and it's a treasure trove of information. There are a number of Facebook pages dedicated to growing pecans, hickories, hickons, chestnuts, walnuts, just a lot of them out there. The NNGA has a Facebook page. Kentucky Nut Growers has a Facebook page. There's a backyard pecan growers page that's really good for home and low input growers, and there are a myriad others out there. All right. The hickories are really my deepest passion, I guess, or my biggest obsession. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the hickories. There are really two that are of significant importance when we're looking at uh, nut production. All of the hickories make a great yard tree, but if you're going to have a big shade tree in the yard, you might as well get nuts that are tasty to eat. So shagbark, which is Carya ovata, and shellbark, which is Carya lacinosa, are the two most desirable hickories when we start looking at nut production, and they're both native to Kentucky. Shagbark is mostly an upland species. It kind of grows on droughty hillsides and that sort of thing. And it has a slow to moderate growth rate. Shellbark is a bottomland species, very much like pecan, and it has a moderate to fast growth rate, fairly comparable to pecan. And here we have the native range maps for shagbark and shellbark, and you can see that most of Kentucky is a native home to both of these hickory species. So they're both present over the vast majority of the state of Kentucky. There's a little pocket over in western Kentucky, looks like in LBL, where shellbars are not particularly prominent. Hickories, like pecan, are monoecious, meaning they have both male and female flowers on the same plant, but they, unlike pecans, have varying levels of dichogamy. A lot of the hickories are self-pollinating, but they certainly will produce better nut crops if you have multiple varieties planted. So you get cross-pollination, you'll get better nut crops, perhaps better kernel fill. I have one shellbark that I collect from here in Christian County that there's not another one within miles that I'm aware of, and it makes a huge crop. But some of those nuts are not all that excuse me, all that well filled. Shellbark and shagbark can cross-pollinize one another. They can hybridize, and there are a few selections out there that are known to be hybrids of the two. And they can also cross with pecans and bitternut hickories. The shagbark and shellbark and the pecans and bitternuts all have 32 chromosomes, and they will interbreed. Some of the other hickories like mockernut and pignut have 64 chromosomes, and they will not cross with the 32 chromosome hickories and pecans. Uh, the shellbark and shagbark hickories will occasionally cross pollinate and hybridize with pecan and with bitternut, and this produces trees that are known as hickons and bitcans, depending on whether it's a pecan or a bitternut parent on the other side. And the major pecan that we've discussed previously, when they've done genetic analysis on it, is actually a complex hickon because it has gene markers that are common to bitternut hickory, shagbark hickory, and nutmeg hickory in its genetic makeup. So at some point in time, within the last 4 to 5 generations, it had a parent that was a hybrid, probably of bitternut and shagbark. So a grandparent or a great grandparent in its background was a hybrid. Here's a picture of two of my local hickory finds. The one on the left is a shagbark. It's the Sinking Fork shagbark. The one on the right is the garnet shellbark. And you can see there's a significant difference in nut size and color. The shagbarks tend to have a light colored nut shell. The shellbarks have a larger nut and they tend to be brown and have a thicker shell than the shagbarks. So a good representation of the two species nuts there. Specifically with the shagbark hickory, they have a very interesting shaggy exfoliating bark. On mature specimens, young trees don't have it, but as they get some age, the bark starts peeling off on these big exfoliating plates. They have fabulous golden yellow fall leaf color. The leaves, as they're unfurling in the spring, often resemble tulips, particularly on the ones that have red pigmented bud scales. The nuts are light colored. They have a hard but relatively thin shell, and the nut kernels are very flavorful and they have a high oil content. Mature trees are fairly large. They'll go up to 90 feet in height and 50 to 70 feet in spread. So here's on the left that typical shaggy bark on those mature trees. And on the left, that's that unfurling bud early in the spring. And the ones with the red pigmented bud scales are really nice. They're really noticeable. Some varieties or some selections have green pigmented bud scales, so it just looks like a green tulip unfurling. Picture on the left is a mature uh, shagbark hickory. That one is at least 60 to 70 years old. And on the left is one of the better shagbark selections, Lorraine. It's a large nut. That's kind of fuzzier than I realized it was. It's a large nut for a shagbark. It has a really thin shell, as thin as some pecans, and it cracks out mostly in intact halves. Really good flavor on that one as well. So shagbark seedlings have a very long juvenile period. If you're growing them from seed, you're looking at 20 to 25 years or longer for them to come into production. Grafted trees, again, will bear nuts in probably half that time or less. There are many improved varieties of hickories, but almost all of them have been chance finds in the wild. We're just now getting to the point that we're having some new introductions that have come out of actual breeding programs or perhaps just people planting seed nuts from select trees. Hickory cultivars are typically grafted onto seedling pecan or shellbark rootstock because they grow faster and they grow longer, or at least pecan grows longer into the season than the hickories do. So a pecan rootstock will push additional growth that you wouldn't see in a hickory on its own roots. And it may actually, at least anecdotally, lead to a slightly larger nut and better nut feel. So we use northern pecan seedlings extensively as a rootstock for grafting improved hickories onto. Shagbark cultivars that are good for Kentucky. Granger is probably the gold standard for shagbarks. Lorraine is a Granger seedling, and it may be better than the mother. Ernest is another one that looks like it's probably a Granger seedling. J. Yoder #1 is a nut out of Ohio, and it's right up there with Lorraine and Granger. uh, Porter, Lizzie Mountain, which is a really good shagbark out of North Carolina. Sinking Fork and Happy Hollow are local Christian County nuts that I've selected that are really good. Polly's Bend, Cook, and Worth and Wilmoth are all Kentucky origin shagbark selections. Wesky is one that was selected by one of the pioneer nut growers, Carl Wesky, in Minnesota, and it's actually a shagbark bitternut hybrid, but it cracks out like a shagbark and it has a good flavor as opposed to the bitternut, which has a very astringent kernel. All of these varieties that I've listed above have either very thin shells or they crack out well and give you mostly intact halves and quarters. Shellbark hickory, commonly called kingnut hickory or river hickory or big scaly bark hickory. They're a large tree at maturity. They can be 60 to 100 feet tall. They also have a shaggy exfoliating bark, but it's not as prominent as what we see on the shagbark hickories. And their nuts are much larger. They're brown and they have a good flavor, but generally have a lower oil content than do the shagbark nuts. So this on the left is a picture of the garnet shellbark tree. It was planted in the front yard of the home of a friend of mine. Her mother planted this tree in 1940. Well, the house is now gone and it's essentially growing in the middle of a corn and soybean field. But that's an 80, 85-year-old tree right there. Um, On the left is a picture of the bark. You can see that it's kind of scaly, flaking off, but not quite as prominently as what we see with the shagbark hickories. Uh, the shellbarks and all the other hickories, for that matter, except pecans, have a really good, bright, golden yellow fall color. Pecans are variable. A lot of them just go from green to brown, and that's it. But some of them will have pretty good yellow fall color. And it makes me wonder, do those have some hickory in their background? Maybe they had a grandparent or great grandparent that actually was a shagbark or something. On the left is a really good shellbark nut. You can see that that one has a relatively thin shell and it's going to crack out mostly intact halves. Pests and diseases are less of a problem with the hickories than they are for pecan. The shagbark and shellbark really kind of co-evolved with the scab fungus, and it doesn't really bother them. Twig girdlers and pecan and hickory weevils are the biggest problems that I see with the hickories. The twig girdlers can cut a lot of limbs out of these trees, and oftentimes before the nuts have fully matured. Pecan weevils get into the hickory nuts and they really, really like them. So some trees seem to be more bothered by pecan weevils than others. The J. Yoder #1, I have a friend who's the hickory expert for Kentucky, and he swears that Yoder will recognize weevil infested nuts and abort them before they develop. I don't know if that's true or not. Hickory horn devil is the caterpillar of the regal moth, and it uses hickories as its host plant. And it's really, really, ex it's really exciting to see and very scary for some people because they're a huge caterpillar. We're talking like a 6-inch long caterpillar, and they have these big, menacing looking horns, but they are not dangerous. They're not poisonous, but people find these and they're scared of them. But that's a hickory horned devil. So shellbark cultivars that are recommended for Kentucky. And again, we usually put these shellbark selections on pecan rootstock. They will grow well on seedling shellbark rootstock. I probably would not put them on shagbark because it just doesn't grow fast enough to do a good job of supporting those to make good nut crops. But Simpson #1 is the Kentucky origin shellbark. It's a tree that's over 600 years old and still producing heavily every year. Lebanon Junction is another really, really good Kentucky origin shellbark. Produces a big nut that cracks out mostly intact halves. They come out of that shell like a great big cookie. Garnet, a it's probably the most productive nut tree of any species I've ever seen. It's a Kentucky origin tree from right here in Christian County. Mitch Russell is a central Kentucky tree that's actually a hybrid between shagbark and shellbark, and it makes a nice sized nut with a thin shell that cracks out well. Fayette is a Pennsylvania origin nut, and it may be the gold standard for shellbarks across the world. Browse, Holterman, Bullnut, Roush, Big Cypress, Excelsior Springs are all good selections that were made out of either Pennsylvania or Ohio or Missouri, and they all perform very well here in Kentucky. They make a nice sized nut that cracks out well. Seedling hickories may take, as we said, 20 or more years to come into production, but there's increasing interest in people growing out seedlings of named cultivars taken from orchards of numerous grafted cultivars. And it looks at this point in time, and we're early in this, that those seedlings may have a really high incidence of being top quality nuts with qualities similar to the parent varieties. I have a group of about 15 seedlings of Fayette that I planted in 1998, and thus far about four of them have come into production. And here I have a photo of those four along with their parent, the Fayette nut, which is a nice high quality nut. And as you can see, most of the nuts from these four seedlings are all very, very similar in shape and quality to the Fayette mother. Some of them are larger, but they all crack out almost intact halves in 75% of the cases. They don't trap kernels, but the chances of a good pecan coming from seed nuts planted from a grove of grafted trees is about 1 in 100, maybe, could be comparable to the parent. With the hickories, it looks like we may be looking at 1 out of every 4 or 5 are comparable to the parent. So, if you don't want to plant grafted hickories, if you can get some named parentage seedlings, you may have a really good nut at some point in time. But you may be waiting 20 to 25 years for them. If you're pushing with fertilizer, you might get that in 15. This is an illustration of kind of what we're looking for with a hickory, whether it's a shagbark or a shellbark. These are both shellbarks. The nut on the left is just a random wild shellbark that I collected off my farm, and you can see the shell is relatively thick, but it's got these really prominent ridges that push down or project down, and they would trap nut kernel when you tried to crack that nut. Whereas on the on the right, this is one of those Fayette seedlings. It has a nice big open central cavity. It only has these two little short ribs. They don't really trap the nut kernel. And this one cracks out mostly intact halves. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for when we're trying to select a hickory for cracking characteristics. Ideally, the thinner the shell than the other, but I have seen some that had a fairly thick shell but an open central cavity, and they cracked out very, very nicely. So here's a nice little bowl of sinking fork shagbark hickory nuts, hickory nut meats, and on the right is hickory syrup. Historically, that's been made by pulling strips of bark off the shagbark trees and boiling it down and straining it, adding sugar and cooking it down. I make mine from the nutshells I have left over after I crack and pick out my nuts. So there's no lichens, no poison ivy, no bird poop. It's a clean product, but it's very tasty, very comparable to maple syrup, only better. I think that's all I have. No, I'm not. Sources. Grafted nut trees, particularly hickories and pecans, northern pecans, have been hard to find. There was a nursery here in Kentucky for many years, and the owner died back in 2020, so that one's not open. But there is Rockbridge Trees in Bethpage, Tennessee, and he has a great selection of grafted northern pecan and hickory varieties. I've seen his trees. They're all container grown and they look fabulous. You'll be looking at close to $100 per tree, but they are ready to transplant. And there's very little transplant shock since these have been grown in containers from day one. Perfect Circle Farm in Berlin, Vermont is another friend of mine who grows and grafts northern and ultra northern pecans and hickories. And he has a pretty good selection. Grimo Nut Nursery is in Canada, and they offer grafted northern pecans and hickories, as well as other nut trees like walnuts and heart nuts and that sort of thing. I mentioned hicons, and a lot of people go, "Wow, that sounds great. It's a big nut like a pecan, only it's got the hickory flavor," but they're heartbreakers. They're very shy bearers. They're a very vigorous plant, as you might expect from a hybrid. It'd be a hybrid of pecan and shagbark or pecan and shellbark, but they're very shy bearers. And most years, the majority of the nuts that they produce are blanks. I don't know what the problem is. I just have a hard time believing it's pollination, as many different hickories and pecans that I have here, and they are a weevil magnet. Most years, 90 to 95 or 100% of the hicon nuts produced at my farm are weevil infested. So I keep grafting. Every time a new hicon comes up, I graft one copy of it. But if someone has limited space, I have about 100 acres to plant on. If somebody has limited space, I would not recommend planting hicons unless you just want a shade tree and no edible nuts. So nutcrackers, pecans, there's a bunch of different types of pecan crackers on the market, and most of them are going to work well, and most pecan varieties are not going to give you much of an issue. But the hickories, you're going to need a substantial nutcracker produced for cracking hard-shelled nuts like hickories or black walnuts. There are a number of them on the market that work nicely. Mr. Hickory, Kinkle, Get Crackin', the Master Cracker, and Grandpa's Goody Getter are probably some of the more prominently known ones. I've used the Mr. Hickory and the Kinkle, and I have some friends who are big nut growers, and they really like the Grandpa's Goody Getter. I talked about the hickory syrup, typically made from the bark, but if you're cracking and picking out couple of 100 pounds of hickory nuts every year, save those nut shells and boil them down, boil them down to make that syrup.